Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Surviving Life Today podcast. This is the place that we focus on how we are all surviving life today. I'm your host, Kelly McFarland. I'm an anthropologist, researcher, educator, crafter, small business owner, baker, mother, and farmer. And I've got a lot of thoughts about how we're all surviving life today and how we could all craft a better future. Thank you for joining me and welcome. Today's episode is Introduction Series chat about why I became a food anthropologist. So welcome. This is a recording that has kind of been long in the making. I struggle with this aspect of introductions, which is why I did, I think, an entire introduction series to kind of try to make this more pointed. But I am a food anthropologist. And so, as an anthropologist, I study man, I study people, and I'm a cultural anthropologist. So that means that I study cultures of people. I'm specifically interested in food anthropology. And what that means is how we as humans do food. And my focus in food anthropology is on food systems, nutrition, access, farming, and the link between farming and eating, right? So I get interviewed, and this is a meandering answer that I give about why I became a food anthropologist, because it's hard to kind of pinpoint why it really is central to who I am as a person. So just to begin with, I've always had an extreme love of food, of preparing food, of growing food, of understanding like the different ways that people eat food, the different ways food can be prepared. Eggs are fascinating to me. Sugar is fascinating to me. I feel like such a dork in even explaining it because I know that if you are not as into food as I am, then that just sounds very wacky. But I have just always had a personal link to food. And so when I was a child growing up in the 80s, I remember being before school age and sitting in front of the TV, and we didn't have cable or anything like that. And this is like really old TV programming, but I would watch like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And then instead of changing the channel to watch cartoons, I wanted to watch The Frugal Gourmet and Julia Child and Jacques Pepin and all of these different cooks, chefs, bakers who were going to show me how to prepare food. One of my earliest memories is watching The Frugal Gourmet, Chef Smith, dicing vegetables and telling you how to dice vegetables. I remember watching Julia Child cook meringues for the first time and asking my mother if we could do it, and her telling me it was probably too complicated. Life hack, it is not. It's pretty easy. Uh, so I just have a strong link to really enjoying cooking good food. I really just love make the flavor combinations. I have a keen sense of taste and I love it. I love food. And then with that, coupled with my love of food, is I have always loved different cultures of people. I am Puerto Rican and I grew up in North Texas. When I was a child, me and my brothers, or my brothers and I, were the only Puerto Rican people I went to school with. We were in a majority white school, and even as for Hispanic students, I didn't see another Hispanic student at our school until I think it was like the first or second grade, right? So my history of being kind of an outside insider, as anthropologists like to call themselves, has been a long time in the making. Not only did I go to a school where I was severely the minority, but then also we traveled as children with our family a lot. And so I remember going around my family in El Paso and visiting Puerto Rico and all of these different experiences that made me truly build an appreciation for different cultures and how different people do things. Especially, like, I remember when we went to Puerto Rico as a child and digging for clams and then or oysters or whatever. And then after we had filled up a bucket, bringing it to my family to be all proud that we had done that, and then watching as they washed them off and then opened them and ate them. And it was, I'm sure there was more to it than that. But it was just fascinating to me as a child that all of these things were connected. So in my childhood, I did have those experiences of traveling around and kind of being the minority in my school, and sort of being an inside outsider and an outside insider, right? Like I had this experience of being within a group, but having an outside perspective of it quite often. And so I went through a tumultuous childhood. And so when I was a young adult, I decided to go off on my own. I turned 21 a little bit after September 11th, and I don't know if it was kind of the FOMO years, fear of missing out, you only live once, YOLO, or whatever you want to say, but I decided to sell everything that I owned and travel. And this honestly, like, I don't think I realized how the timing was so exceptional for me to be able to do this, because I don't know if people can really do this as easily today. And I think with my ability to be on the computer and having like kind of like the insider knowledge of that, I was a lot more employable when I moved around. And so it made it fairly easy, not easy, but I was determined. So fairly easy for me to move around to different areas around the United States and get a job. Okay. So I was 20 turning 21, and I sold everything that I had, and I moved from North Texas, and I drove to the Northeast. I was born in New Jersey. So my goal was to get to that area. I didn't make it that far, but I did make it close, and I settled down and I worked in the Northeast for about a year. And I lived amongst a lot of really good friends that I still am really good friends with today. And I learned kind of how to be an adult there as one phase. And then I had a friend who was moving out west. And so I wanted to see if the West was the best. So I decided to move out west as well. And so I lived kind of in the desert Southwest for about a year. And then I moved to the Southwest coast for a few years. Then I moved to the Southeast coast for a blink of an eye, and then I came back to Texas. In all of those travels, moving around to these different groups, I was able to meet and live with a lot of different cultures of people, if you will. And that's really how I learned to be an adult. So now as an anthropologist, when I think back on that, I was an anthropologist before I knew what an anthropologist was. Because that's what anthropologists do. They live with different cultures of people to learn from them and learn how they think, what it's like to be a member of the group, and what it's like to live in day-to-day life, right? And so that's what I was doing with all of these different places that I lived. So then I also, when I moved back to North Texas, I was young and married at the time, and I had a child. And right after my oldest daughter was born, I went through a divorce, right? So I was a single mother. I'm really skipping a lot of details here, but I was a single mother for the first 5 years of my oldest child's life. And it was through that I learned kind of the other side of food and what it is to struggle. And keep in mind, I had been moving around the United States for 5 years before then. So I had been traveling around to different sides of the United States, working by myself, living by myself, and I was able to afford to eat. I was able to afford to eat healthily. I've always been a fairly healthy eater. And so once I had a daughter and I had to start thinking about feeding her and paying for daycare and all of those things, that was the first time I really met this struggle. Okay. And I talk about this a lot in class, but it's when I learned about the gap. And so to explain that, I was struggling as a single mother with my oldest daughter in daycare and working full time. I was working, 60 hours a week actually, and I could barely afford to eat. And so my boss told me that I might qualify for food stamps or some other type of government service to help us. And so this was actually we're talking early 2000s. So it was when everything was going online. And I entered all of my information into the website for Health and Human Services to see if I qualified for anything. And it told me that I needed to call. And so I called and I spoke with a lady at Health and Human Services in Texas. And she got all of my information. And I, went through the process of, what do you make? What are you paying for daycare? What are you paying for your rent or mortgage or whatever? And at the end of it all, she kind of sat there for a minute and then she laughed and she goes, "Oh, you make just enough to starve." And I think that moment was when I all of a sudden discovered the gap. And the gap is the fact that we know as a society, we know in our government, and we know in the services that we offer that there is a poverty line that we create as a people. We judge, we say where the poverty line is, right? And then there's a standard of living. And the standard of living is how much you need to make in order to afford healthcare, childcare, food, insurance, rent, a car, a phone, all of the different things that we are now, these subscription services and all of that is just to perpetuate paying for things over and over again. And so all of these different things, that's what goes for the standard of living. Your standard of living is like how much does it cost for me to live in North Texas and be able to afford all those things? Or how much does it cost for me to live anywhere? Australia, England, Hawaii, New York, any place has a standard of living where this is what people need to make in order to afford the life. The poverty line is much different. And the poverty line also in the United States is determined on a federal level. So it's not different state by state. And so we know in academia, in the government, in all of these different areas, we know that there is a huge gap between the poverty line and standard of living. And we know that the people who fall into that gap are struggling so extremely hard to make ends meet. And this is where nonprofits come in and they offer, food pantries, help to pay your bills and things like that, because those nonprofits are trying to help the people who find themselves in the gap. Okay. So, I lived in the gap. And I did receive help. I went to, several different food pantries. I one time had to get help paying an electric bill. There were different ways that I got help in this manner. But I knew from living in this that these solutions that are being thrown down at us from the top, that really they don't even understand what we're living through. They're not working. These top-down solutions are really just kind of judging what the problem is, judging the people who have the problem, and then writing an RX to say, oh, here's what you should do, and it's not taking into account real lived experiences. So from there, when I was considering, when my daughter was 5 years old, I met my husband now, and we got together, we combined our households, and we were in a place to where I could think about what my next steps were professionally. And at that point, I decided the best thing that I could do in order to try to help solve these problems is return to school. And so that's when I returned to school to become an anthropologist. So anthropology, why anthropology, right? So the number one reason that I was interested in becoming an anthropologist is because they specifically target bottom-up solutions, meaning they learn from communities of people about what their lived experience is to try to help them figure out a goal and reach the goal to, progress from wherever they're at, whatever they're wanting to do. Anthropologists, their role is, as applied anthropologists, I should say, is to understand these people and then help them with those next steps. And so going to school was kind of me targeting that, and then specifically food. As I was going to school and specifically targeting this for food, I was thinking what I was going to discover was that people didn't know how to grow food. That was the problem, right? Nobody grows any tomatoes anymore. Nobody does this. Nobody does that. Of course, I was wrong. And one of the main things that I discovered is cooking was actually a big gap for people, just knowing how to cook, knowing how to combine flavors, things like that. Also, understandings of nutrition, and not only understandings of nutrition, but faith in the safety of food. And so people who grow their own food sometimes at first will sometimes struggle with like eating an egg from the chicken that they raised because they don't know if that egg is safe, or eating an apple off of a tree that they grew. And so like these kind of understandings of nutrition and at the same time combining it with safety, that really creates like a crazy way to look at like, how do we solve food, right? And so I know that just saying how do we solve food is really kind of like blanketing over the whole thing. And this is a really complex problem that we have to address. But as I first went into school, I didn't know that, so that was my approach. As I was going through school in undergrad for the basics of anthropology, and then in graduate school to become a Master of Science in anthropology, I discovered that I have a true love for interviewing people, learning from groups of people, and finding patterns. And so that is, as a researcher and as an anthropologist working with groups, that is really kind of where I target my attention, is how can I better understand this group of people through designing interviews and through really learning from them directly. And then how can I kind of research how the world is looking at this problem, right? And then how do I find the patterns in this? And what are the patterns telling me? One of the coolest discoveries that I ever made with finding patterns was a project that I worked on with the anthropology department and the food pantry. So the college that I went to has a food pantry where they help students access food. And we did a research project with that food pantry to understand if it is being successful, if the people who are using the food pantry feel that it is helping them, and why exactly they need the food pantry to begin with, right? And so I participated really from the interview phase on with this. And so when I was working as the assistant to the main researcher in going through all the interviews and finding the patterns, what really stuck out to me was that there were two groups of people that were kind of talking about what their problems were. There were the students who were experiencing food insecurity in terms of they could not access food. They didn't have the money for it, or they ran through their money that they had on their account at the school, or whatever. For whatever reason, they couldn't access food specifically, right? And then the other group of people, their experience was much different, because what they were complaining about was actually the infrastructure. And so they didn't have access to a stovetop to cook food. They didn't have can openers. They didn't have storage. They didn't have a refrigerator to hold food, a microwave to reheat food, all of these different things. And so they might functionally be able to afford to purchase food, right? But if it's 3 a.m. and they just finished studying for a really hard exam, and all of the fast food places are closed, and all of the places where you could purchase food are closed, they could not eat because of a lack of infrastructure. And so this discovery, which, by the way, the primary investigator ran the numbers, and this was a statistically significant discovery, which anybody who does research knows. Statistical significance means that this isn't just me thinking there might be a pattern. This is mathematically a pattern in the data. And so because of that, there was a strong action behind that to correct in any way that we could as a college correct and help. And so the students who were living in dorms that didn't have any kind of infrastructure, their dorms were then equipped with kitchenettes and with an area for them to microwave and keep food, and with these different things for access. In addition, the food pantry started carrying things like can openers and different types of food where you could keep it keep it and eat it without needing to do these additional things, right? And so there were pieces of this where we could solve and we could reach a solution. There's also the other side of this with the students who are experiencing food insecurity, which needs to be targeted. But because of the pattern and because of being able to find this is what happened here and this is how we can help it, we were able to do something, and we were able to help in a big way that I still see around the college today. I still see that these types of thinking about the food infrastructure is present. Okay. So all of that kind of leads to like, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing as an anthropologist? And as an anthropologist who studies food, what am I studying? And so when I think about it, and I think about the fact that I'm so interested in how all of these different groups of people are able to feed themselves and find security and find health, what I'm actually studying is how are all surviving life today? And so I think that kind of wraps it all together in a nice little bow, this podcast itself is really truly interested in how we're all surviving life. And that's what I am interested in also as a professional. So I became an anthropologist to help find solutions. And I believe that there are a lot of ways that the things that I have researched up to this point can help point us to solutions. And this podcast is my way of helping to share this information with the public so that we can generate action steps forward. Okay. So, what do you think? Is my story the craziest, or is it kind of like you could see where this was going, right? I feel like I was somewhat destined to be an anthropologist who studies food, and I love it. And that coupled with the way that I craft things and the way that I like to grow things makes it so that the Surviving Life Today podcast is the culmination of a lot of different things. So I hope you enjoyed this little introduction about why I'm an anthropologist who studies food. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any ideas about other introductions you would like me to create. And don't forget to like, subscribe, hype me up. And I think that is all. So until next time, I hope that you survive and thrive in all that you do. Take care.